Have you ever wondered why Jesus felt the urgency to go into the wilderness to get tempted by the devil? And have you ever wondered why he felt this urgency right after being baptized? This is what we're going to discover today in Mark 1:12. But to understand Mark 12, we need to remember what Mark 11 is saying. Remember, God says, Su ei hohuiosmo, you are my son. The heavens split open and a voice came down. God the Father is speaking. This is a direct reference to Psalm 2, Psalm 2:7, where God says, You are my son. Today I have begotten you. This is the fulfillment of that prophecy. That voice of God the Father is the proclamation of the identity of God the Son. You are my son. Okay, is the announcement from God the Father of the identity of the Trinity. We've seen it in the previous video. So once we have this in mind, we can move on to Mark 1:12 and read Kai euthus to pneuma autonic balei eisten eremon. Today's verse is very short, so we're going to have some time to focus on just a couple of words that I think are the main thing here. One is the verb ekbale, and the other one is the term eremon. But let's go step by step. If the verb is ekbale, the subject is to pneuma, is the subject. Okay, this is the verb. And auton, we're going to see, is the object. Eisten eremon, we've seen it so many times. The preposition a means into, so into something. So indicates a place, a movement into a place. Kai, we know, is the usual conjunction, and euthus is an adverb that we have already encountered in Mark. So the structure, grammatically speaking, is very, very easy. Kai euthus. If you remember, Mark 1:10 starts exactly the same way. Kai euthus. And immediately after. And as soon as, remember, Mark in 1:10 was describing Jesus coming out of the water after his baptism, and he's saying immediately after coming out of the water, the heaven split apart. Okay, here's the same thing. And soon after, immediately after. This is a very peculiar way of Mark of moving from one image to the next. As we have already commented, Mark, out of all the evangelists, is probably the one that is most vivid in how he describes what he tells. So this idea of using this expression kaiuthus that Mark loves so much and uses so many times throughout his gospel, differently from all the other evangelists, is typical of his writing style. Very vivid, very graphics. He wants to keep the reader engaged. Things keep happening one after the other, more and more interesting every time. Okay, it's a way of keeping the pace very fast, short sentences to keep the reader engaged with him. So kaiuthus, and soon after, what happens? To pneuma, we already seen that. To is the neuter definite article, because pneuma is neuter. In the nominative case, is the subject, means the Spirit. The Spirit. This is the Holy Spirit that appears all the time in the first chapter of Mark. It appears in the form of a dove. It appears because it enters as auton into him. So Jesus is completely full of Holy Spirit. And now the Holy Spirit is at work again. And soon after, the Holy Spirit, verb, ekbale. Now, as anticipated, let's spend some time on this verb. Ekbale comes from the verb ekbalo. And as you can imagine, it's made up of the preposition ek that we have already seen many times, means out of, is a movement out of a place. and the verb ballo. Now, the verb ballo is one of the most used in Greek and means to throw, literally to throw, to cast. Okay, to cast. So, in itself, contains the idea of strength, of even some kind of violence, if you will. And with this ek in front, it's even stronger. You're not just throwing, you're not just casting, you're throwing out, you're casting out, you're plucking out. If you think about it, there's a word in English, for example, ballistics. Ballistics is whatever regards the motion of an object flying in the air. Why? Because you threw it. Ballistics come from the Greek word ballo, which means to throw. But who is the spirit throwing out? Well, auton. We've seen this many times. This is a personal pronoun. And in this case, it's in the accusative, meaning object. Okay, accusative case. So it means him, meaning Jesus. Okay. So, and straight away, immediately after that, the Spirit throws him out. We go with the literal meaning here, throws him out. I want to point out that Mark here is using a simple present tense, indicative present. He throws. So in the previous section, Mark was talking in the past. Jesus came, Jesus was baptized, Jesus saw the heavens opening, and so on. And all of a sudden, he switches to the present. Why? Again, this is all part of the style of writing of Mark, which is very vivid. The use of the present indicates something that is happening right here, right now. It makes the reader experience the event as if the reader were there assisting to what was happening. And where is the Spirit throwing Jesus? Well, eis ten edemon. Eis is the usual preposition into that, as we know, wants the accusative case after it. And here we have it. Eta nu is the feminine singular definite article, the, and the eremon is the accusative case of the adjective eremos, which means desert, isolated. So as a noun, it means the wilderness, the desert. We already seen this at the beginning of Mark at least a couple of times, where John the Baptist appears preaching in the desert, and then the prophecy from Isaiah, a voice calling in the desert, prepare the way of the Lord. It's the same idea. So, and immediately afterward, the Spirit throws him out into the wilderness. Let's go and read, just for fun, the different translations, English translations that you can find in different Bible versions. For example, New International Version says, at once the Spirit sent him out. New Living Translation, the Spirit then compelled Jesus to go. English Standard Version, the Spirit immediately drove him out. BSB, drove Jesus into the wilderness. BLB, the Spirit drives him out. So all this in the past, this one is the first one that uses the present. The Spirit drives him, present. New KJV, the Spirit drove him. NASB, the Spirit brought him out. NASB 95, impel him to go. 77, impel him to go. Amplified Bible, forced him out. Christian Standard Bible, drove him into, and so on and so forth. We could go on forever. All of them, all of these translations go around the idea of driving somebody out, sending somebody out, bringing somebody out. Some of them going to the impelled or forced or compelled, which are a little bit stronger, but really none of them capture the strong image that Mark is trying to convey. Why is that? The first thing to realize to really understand how to translate correctly this verb ekbale is one, that this verb is in the present. Okay, so there's really no need to convert this into the past. If Mark uses the present, is because he wants to give a certain idea. The idea is to give the immediacy of the action. No need to translate it in the past. But most importantly, we don't have to hide behind the finger. If the verb ekbalo means to throw, well, that's the meaning of the verb. And there's no need to edulcorate anything. Now, think about that. If you drive a person out of a place, if you lead a person out of a place, if you bring a person out of the place, even if you compel somebody to go out of a place, none of this is not even close to the idea of throwing somebody out of a place, right? If you take somebody or bring somebody out of your house or drive somebody out of your house or compel somebody to go out of your house, it means that yes, you convince them to go out of your house. But if you say that you threw somebody out of your house, that's a much, much stronger image. And if Mark wanted to say, drive him out, leave him out, lead him out, send him out, bring him out, he knew how to say that. Why did he choose this specific verb, such a graphic, we could say even violent verb? Let's go and see all the other cases where Mark uses this verb, ekbalo, because this may be a coincidence. This may be, one of those cases where, yeah, Mark used one verb, but really what he meant was something else. And if you read a lot of commentaries on this verse of Mark, a lot of scholars, a lot of theologians are going to explain to you that yes, this verb generally contains some kind of forceful violence in it. But of course, since it's applied to the Holy Spirit cannot be violent, can he? So it cannot possibly mean throw him out. It meant simply send him out, let him out. Now, again, why would Mark use this verb if that were the meaning? Let's go and see where Mark uses this verb in other situation in his gospel. Well, he uses this verb many times, so it's going to be pretty easy to understand in Mark's mind what ekbalo means. First, he uses this verb every time Mark needs to describe Jesus casting out devils out of people. Okay? Every time Jesus is said to be casting out demons out of people, this is the verb that Mark uses. So when Jesus casts demons out of people, he ekbale demons out of them. Okay? This is the idea of the verb ekbalo. Ekbalo is the action of taking, grabbing something or somebody that is inside a certain place, plucking that object or person out of the place with violence, and throwing it away, far away from their place, from that place. That's the idea. That's what happens when Jesus casts demons out of people. He ideally takes them, plucks them out of the people, and throws them away. That's what he does. Another example where Mark uses this verb is when Jesus is preaching that if your eye is an occasion of sin for you, you should pluck it out. Pluck your eye out. Your eye out. It's a pretty graphic image, isn't it? We should pluck our eyes out if they are an occasion for sin for us. Very violent image. No need to adulcorate anything here. The third example where Mark uses this verb is when Jesus casts people out of the temple. Remember? Did Jesus let them out? Compel them to go out? Force them to go out? Yes. But most of all, he threw them out of the temple with violence. That's the only place and only time that Jesus really used material violence. And that's when Mark uses that verb, ekbale. When Jesus throws people out of the temple because they are blaspheming the temple with their goats, with their business, with their money, he ekbale them out of the temple. These are all the cases where Mark uses the verb ekbalo. It contains the idea of strong violence. Why would this ekbalo right here in Mark 1:12 have a completely different meaning? Well, the solution for me is just one. Not try to hide the violence of this verb behind any type of edulcorate translation, but simply acknowledging it and try to understand it. This should be the honest way to go whenever there's something in scriptures that kind of clashes with our expectations. The standard way to go usually is if something clashes with our own sensibility and if something doesn't seem to be aligned with our own sensibility, we are easy and quick to jump into the text and try to find a translation that aligns with our own sensibility, stepping over the original text. This is not an honest way to proceed, and also is a very dangerous one because it pushes us to find interpretations that are not directly taken from the text and possibly missing out on the correct interpretation of the text. This is one of the cases. If we just translate this as let him out, send him out, we are missing out on an important aspect of what is happening here. And what Mark is trying to say here is very clear. He uses this kind of violent verb, ekbale, because he wants to convey a particular idea of Jesus being completely possessed by the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is taking total control of Jesus' man. And since Jesus becomes an object in the hands of the Holy Spirit treats him as if Jesus were an object. And he throws him out because Jesus is completely following the will of the Holy Spirit, which is the will of the Father. That's what Mark is trying to say. To understand this, we need to go back to the previous verse. God the Father has just declared Jesus to be his Son, the beloved, the elected, the chosen one. And as such, Jesus surrenders his will to the will of the Father. The first act, the first public act of Jesus is to surrender his will to the will of the Father. The Father takes control of the Son through the Holy Spirit and drives him, throws him wherever he wants. And Jesus just obeys. And this verb ekbale is here to tell us that Jesus is not going to the wilderness by his own will, but he's going there just because that is the will of his Father. And the will of his Father is precise, and is that Jesus needs to separate himself from the society. That's why God the Father gives the order to the Holy Spirit to take control of Jesus, of God the Son, and separate him pluck him out from civilization, from society, and throws him far away from everybody else in a completely deserted place. So we responded to the first question: why does Jesus feel the impulse to go into the wilderness? Well, it's because he is completely controlled by the Holy Spirit sent by his Father. He's just following his Father's will. But why would be his Father's will that he gets completely secluded from society into the wilderness? Why does his Father sends him into the wilderness? The answer lies in this term, eremon, the wilderness. In the Old Testament, this term appears hundreds of times. It's what in Hebrew is called midbar. Midbar. Okay, midbar, like that, midbar. Now, midbar is the wilderness, is the secluded place, solitary place where nobody lives. Now, the wilderness represents a very important environment in the Old Testament. It's not just a place, it's the place where the Israelites spent 40 years. After being freed from the Egyptians, they crossed the Red Sea, and before entering the Promised Land, they will spend 40 years going around in circle within the Arabian Peninsula. Complete desert, complete wilderness, hostile place. That's the meaning of midbar. The wilderness is the place of temptation. It's the background, we could put it. It's the background of temptation where the people of Israel will be tested for 40 years. You start seeing the connection here. God the Father is sending his Son into the wilderness as he had thrown his people into the wilderness of the Arabian Peninsula for 40 years to test them, to temper them. And you see also the connection between the 40 days that Jesus will spend in the desert and the 40 years that the Israelites spent in the desert, being tested by what? By hunger, by thirst, by wild beasts, by enemies, by pestilence, by death, and so on. The Father sending his Son into the wilderness to be tempted is then the fulfillment of the Old Testament story of the Israelites being tested in the wilderness for 40 years.